It's the virtual version of the My Broadband 2020 Cloud Conference, and it's a great pleasure to welcome the Head of Interconnection and Peering at Teraco, Michele McCann, joining us, and she's got a great presentation lined up for us. Michele, I mean, you guys must have seen some extraordinary traffic since the lockdown has started. It's great to see you. I'm looking forward to your presentation, the digital transformation reality. So I'm going to hand over to you without any further ado. Looking forward to this. Over to you, Michele.
Thanks, Aki. Yes, we did see a huge amount of traffic happening over the pandemic specifically. And today I'm going to take you through a little bit around what we've actually seen and why I call it the digital transformation reality, and what organizations need to start thinking about if they haven't already in terms of implementing their digital strategies. So we see a lot in terms of the press and a lot of write-ups around what digital transformation is. And our team here at Teraco, we actually deal with a lot of the organizations and network engineers who kind of need to make this thing happen. And I think besides the whole list of what we actually see, the key part and the fundamental part around any digital strategy needs to rely around interconnection. And kind of what interconnection really means is your connectivity. If you don't have your connectivity in place, there's no point in you trying to be able to implement everything else. So everything kind of starts with that interconnection point and how you can reach any end device that you want to. So we kind of put together a little infrastructure checklist, which hopefully can help a couple of people when reviewing their strategies. But the key out of these ones that we're seeing come up more and more is around latency, essentially around your security. As we've seen, there's been a huge amount of threats and attacks that have happened recently, and it's how to implement that ICT strategy in a secure manner, as well as your cost savings. So, I mean, times are getting tougher, but we all need to keep up with the times, and how do we implement these kinds of strategies? So around that ecosystem, as I mentioned, and the interconnection side of it, and we've seen a number of organizations implement this incredibly successfully, is by them putting down a central infrastructure where they can essentially start interconnecting not only to just their normal network operators that they use on a day-to-day basis, but also global content type people. So your Akamais, your Cloudflares, your Netflix, your Facebooks, your etc., those kind of guys, as well as your IT service providers, so the guys who can actually get their hands on the ground and be able to make things happen. Cloud operators, so with Microsoft and Amazon's regions going live in South Africa, many people have had to implement cloud strategies, and with the pandemic happening on top of this, it has actually caused people to start having to implement these strategies a lot faster. So we're seeing a huge amount of cloud connections happening on a day-to-day basis to both operators, both Microsoft and Amazon.
I mean, Michele, when you look at sorry, Michele, I don't mean to interrupt you, but when you look at the enterprise and you talk about this interconnection strategy, what is the benefit for an enterprise, for example, on what you're talking about to your slide?
Absolutely. So it's around actually, reducing cost, because we always look at cost. The second side around it is improving that security, because now essentially that interconnect, if you picture it, is a cable between yourself and, let's say, a cloud operator with no one in between. So now you start managing, how do I get from my network straight through to that cloud operator? So there's control, additional resilience, because now instead of you being able to own these servers and watch the lights every day, you're now outsourcing that. So you've got to make sure that that interconnectivity is up all the time. Especially now more than ever with staff working at home, etc. It can really affect productivity if there's an outage. And then the other thing is latency. We now in the world of Africa, there's been a huge amount of investment happening with content and cloud, etc., coming to our shores. Now latency starts becoming key. It's no longer am I fetching this content in Europe. I'm now fetching it here locally in Africa, and how's that latency and the service being delivered to my end user? Then the kind of last point, which is it's kind of a new thing that we're starting to see happen here in Africa, rather than in Europe it's been happening, and in the States it's been happening for a number of times, is that direct interconnectivity between the enterprise network and their various third parties, i.e. their partners, where we're starting to see banks directly interconnect with the retailer rather than using that over internet bandwidth, etc. And the reason, once again, is that diversity, that control, and that cost savings. And we're starting to see that happen more and more. And I suppose what's enabled this, and I'm sure if you remember my broadband years ago, this cable list was a lot shorter than that. So essentially around in cable investment has really enabled for all of this to actually happen in Africa. And without the cables, you wouldn't have seen any cloud investment, you wouldn't have seen sort of the content investment, and you wouldn't have seen big data centers like a Teraco start emerging. And you see the whole list of cables there, but there's also another two that are actually quite interesting and starting to happen. And the one is the Aquano cable, which is the Google initiative. And the other exciting one is the To Africa cable infrastructure, which is the Facebook initiative. And all this really does is it starts adding more and more access coming to our shores. And with more and more access coming to our shores, it means more and more content and cloud can easily be delivered to that end user. The exciting initiatives that we're seeing also happen is the terrestrial networks, so the cross-border networks, connecting African countries to each other. Previously, and still a lot today, you're seeing a lot of traffic routing outside to Europe and coming all the way back again, which then once again affects that cost as well as the latency to the end user. So now we're starting to see these surrounding countries start saying, hang on, there's this huge amount of infrastructure sitting in South Africa. Instead of us routing all the way through to Europe and back again, how do we essentially cross that border and pick up all this content and cloud and bring it back into our own economies? Latency. So I keep harping onto the latency factor. And this really has changed the name of the game for ISPs, enterprises, and even data centers like ourselves. And kind of the interesting thing is, why has the cloud come all the way to South Africa? There's other places in Africa where they can deploy large regions. But the key factor is actually around that latency point. If you look at us from Europe, we're the furthest point. So I kind of like to say, in the world of internet, the world is flat when you look at the latency graphs. So the exciting thing for these cloud operators is they come in, they deploy in South Africa, and they're not only servicing South African end users. They look at South Africa as a southern African region, which then services multiple African countries. And if you look at these latency stats, so Johannesburg, Nairobi, for example, there's only 52 milliseconds. So you start seeing that, hang on, now only I can start servicing multiple countries with a single region deployment, and which is fantastic from Africa, because if you had to look at, let's say, Nairobi to London, you're starting to look at 137 milliseconds of latency.
That's pretty quick.
Now a user sitting in Nairobi essentially is starting to have an improved service. So in terms of interconnectivity and how to reach these cloud locations and where they're essentially located is there's two main geographic deployments at the moment, one in Teraco Isando, Johannesburg, and the other one in Teraco, Cape Town. Both of those, if you see all the cloud brands at the bottom, and we know that there's some future cloud brands coming down the line next year. But the fantastic thing is from Teraco, you can essentially start having that full multi-cloud strategy without having to do multiple deployments. So it starts making that deployment infrastructure a lot easier for the IT manager out there.
So when you want to connect, for example, to one of those cloud providers, Where would you say is the closest on-ramp?
The closest on-ramp, depending on your location as an enterprise, and your strategies. So a lot of enterprises have a geo-resilience strategy that they need to deploy in multiple cities. So essentially, you can go to Teraco Isando for your Johannesburg strategy, and Teraco Cape Town for your Cape Town strategy.
Okay.
And then you can do a full resilience by just running multiple interconnects to these cloud operators. Then another way to interconnect is something that we've recently launched in Africa. It's been done all over the world, but essentially what you call a cloud exchange, which simplifies interconnection even more. So a typical interconnection is at a layer 1 level, where I run multiple cables to multiple people within a data center. What we've done here is we've invested huge switching infrastructure in both our Isando and Cape Town facilities, where what an enterprise can do is come in, connect to the cloud exchange, and run multiple virtual circuits to any cloud operator of their choice, thereby turning up circuits immediately to whoever they want, so there's no time delay, reducing bandwidth costs, because there's no bandwidth fees around connecting to these. It's just a simple interconnect, and increasing security, as it's purely a layer 2 connection between the enterprise and the cloud operator of their choice. So we did some latency tests. So we thought, regions coming local, what does that actually mean? So we did some tests around what it really means that a cloud region is sitting in Africa. So we turned up resources on Azure, and we turned them up in Europe as well as in the Johannesburg region. And we saw the latency difference. Previously in Europe was 171 milliseconds, and now it's gone down to less than 2 milliseconds. So that really does show that you can implement a cloud strategy now. And it's not necessarily about us always talking about it, which we've been doing for years. It really can be done. And we turned this up. It took us a couple of hours to do the tests. I mean, we were still learning about what the Azure platform is. So the longer time it took to push the buttons and the buttons. But once we got it up and running, it was fantastic. And then we had a full routing environment to anywhere across the world. The other big thing that has kind of, I think, changed Africa and grown Africa into the leagues of what you see in Europe and the States is internet peering. So NAPAfrica is our internet exchange. And essentially all an internet exchange is once again a huge amount of switches sitting in a data center that interconnects a cloud and content person straight through to a network operator, an enterprise, and an IT service provider, providing shortest route for their end users to be able to reach key internet applications. So we've seen this over the pandemic has grown tremendously, where I mean, it took us 8 years to get the exchange to over terabit of peering capacity. And within 5 months, we saw 1.5 terabits of peering capacity. So that kind of shows you how people are going online during these times. And funny enough, as the market starts opening up and the levels start reducing, we're actually seeing the traffic not drop. We're seeing it grow. So what that tells us is that the adoption from an internet perspective is there and continues to happen on an ongoing basis. So we put together just some information and graphs on what we see, and kind of this is last year June versus this year June, and you can see the growth in traffic has just really boomed, which is fantastic. And I think this is owed to South Africans starting to have access to internet services, fiber to the home, and starting to see all their hard work and out their large networks across South Africa. People really do have access to internet. So on this, once we looked at the traffic, we wanted to kind of see what are people doing, because we're a curious bunch. So once we looked at the data, we wanted to actually have a look at what people are consuming on a day-to-day basis in terms of the internet. And it's the usual suspects that you see, that we know is the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, etc. But what we've funnily enough seen a huge amount of growth in is in the gaming market.
Oh.
So that's where you will see the Akamais, the Cloudflares, the Verizons, and the Limelights. They're essentially the ones delivering the key content such as Fortnite, etc., to our shores that we're able to game on an ongoing basis. And once again, as levels open up, you would think, with kids going back to school, this gaming traffic would start reducing, and it's actually not, which is fantastic. It finally means that we're building a true gaming or African gaming community that's happening on our shores.
I mean, Michelle, it's fascinating looking at that slide, and I would imagine like video is probably the biggest consumption in terms of data amongst all of that. But what's the most popular? I would imagine something like Netflix, for example, would be probably the most popular, or am I wrong?
Well, interestingly, it's a difference between daytime traffic and nighttime traffic and weekend type traffic. So your Netflix, you'll see a lot in the evenings and also on the weekends. What we did see early on in the lockdown stages while people were getting online and trying to understand their company VPNs, etc., we did see a huge spike of Netflix traffic during the day. What we have seen is that kind of normalize, and we actually see a lot of Teams traffic. So a lot of online videos, people going online, communicating with each other on a day-to-day basis. And that's become your business type traffic. So we're seeing that grow on an ongoing basis. What we're also starting to see is around peering services is very specialized type peering services that are starting to become available. So recently announced, and this is the first time we're announcing it, is that my broadband cloud is that Microsoft Azure peering services are now available at NAPAfrica. So what that means for the enterprise is they can start getting a more service assured access to key applications like O365, Dynamics, and Teams. They can also start getting access to telemetry type services, which then allows them to see what are the latency figures that are actually being delivered to them, the BGP routes, as well as any alerts. So if you're having any leaks or hijacks, etc., you can start getting those notifications for these kinds of applications. And as we've seen, O365 has now become the kind of a requirement within a business due to the fact that people are all working remotely. And it seems like that's going to be a long-term situation that needs to happen. So at NAPAfrica, you can connect to the exchange at no cost, and you can start picking up these applications directly to the Microsoft network, saving you a lot of money as well as improving that latency, and then having the measuring tools around it to be able to deliver back into your organization. So I suppose all of this kind of leads into the data center and what's happened to Teraco with all this data center, data explosion, and all this information and all the online working that's happening. So you'll see these are our current two facilities that we have in place. And during lockdown, we were successfully able to even complete the new facility, which is across the road from the current facilities. So that's bringing a 60 megawatt site into and live. It's now live and ready for service, which is fantastic because that means anybody, once again, going to that interconnect strategy can easily deploy in the new site, get access to all the latest and greatest technology from data center deployments, and then run just a physical cross connect to anyone that they want, be it a content, a cloud, a network operator, another partner of theirs. It's literally that cable away from whoever they need to get to.
Gee,
Then we
it's
have
fantastic. It's fantastic to see how much money you guys are investing in this digital transformation. It's extraordinary. I remember going to your data center a few years ago, and to see this and the extensions and even more money being spent, it's absolutely wonderful to see the investment that you guys are making in this digital transformation.
The exciting thing around that, Aki, is it's not only our investment, it's investment that global organizations are doing on the African shores.
Yeah.
Which then enables you and me as the end user to have access to more information that we never could before.
Yeah.
And it starts growing this huge ecosystem, which then helps us on the street to be able to deliver services. Then we have a Bradell campus, and you'll see it's one of our first forays in solar. It's been quite an exciting venture around there, but very much a large hyperscale type campus, which is fantastic for any enterprise wanting to do a DR strategy to Isando. So essentially, if you need to deploy your high interconnectivity point, you can put it in Isando, and you need some kind of a hot type deployment. Bradell is perfectly located latency-wise to be able to do that. So you can have a deployment in Isando, deployment in Bradell, run hot, and then tick all the compliancy queries that are required to be able to do that. And then exciting, funny enough, our Cape Town and Durban facilities, they may look a lot smaller than those Joburg facilities, but there's a huge amount of growth that we're seeing around these. And so interesting one is the Durban facility. There's a huge amount of cable investment that's gone in there. So going live this year is the cable called the Metis cable, which then links up all the islands. So Mauritius, Reunion, Madagascar, etc. To be able to deliver those low latency routes. And that's becoming more and more important, especially if you look at communication between South Africa and Mauritius. We have a lot of South Africans and even businesses expanding their operations into somewhere like Mauritius. And how do you get that low latency route to such a key island, essentially? And then Cape Town, as mentioned before, one of the key locations for cloud on-ramps. But what we have done is we have broken ground, and we're on the first level of our new expansion, which won't let me change the slides. There we go. So we've broken ground, and we're on the first level for our new expansion called Cape Town 2, which will be ready Q4 2021. And you'll see this is now starting to mimic a lot of the Johannesburg type power requirements, where this will be a 30 megawatt site. And the driving force around that is exactly to what I mentioned earlier, is that ability for an enterprise to be able to deploy in Johannesburg, deploy in Cape Town, and then easily interconnect those cloud and content operators.
I mean, this is so impressive, Michelle. I mean, when you look at the stuff that you guys are doing, and I mean, when you look at the start in Isando and where you're going up to 2021, I don't know if you're allowed to talk about it, but is there some kind of value to the investment that Teraco is making into this incredible industry? Have you quantified that yet?
So that wouldn't be for my public release. So in terms of quantifying the value from Teraco, is at the moment we look after 18,000 interconnects and growing at over 300 new interconnects on a monthly basis. So that kind of demonstrates how people have essentially moved into the data center and starting to really leverage this platform amongst each other to create the reliability, to improve the latency and improve the costs. Cool, that's me, Aki.
Well, you know what, Michelle, it's been absolutely fascinating just looking at those slides. And if anybody has any question as to the digital transformation that's been happening and, you know, the cloud transformation and the journey that people are taking, and how businesses and enterprises and even us as consumers are having our lives changed by technology, by, you know, the businesses like Teraco's, for example, and you look at those kind of investments, investments. This is where it's all coming, and the fruit is now beginning to bear, and it's beautiful and it's exciting. And let's not forget, it wasn't too long ago that our videos were buffering. So I think we've come such a long way in, I mean, even as short as 5 years ago, it was a problem. But wow, it's quite extraordinary just to watch those slides and look at the capacity that we as businesses and individuals are taking out of the system, and what capacity is being added to the system. Because, you know, looking at the investment that you guys are making, you're obviously expecting an extraordinary increase in demand of that digital transformation and journey to the cloud that you've been talking about.
Yeah, Aki. Yes, we're looking forward to future growth, more cloud investment in Africa, and more people going online.
Well, an absolute pleasure talking to you. Michele McCann, the Head of Interconnecting and Peering at Teraco. Thank you for your presentation at the My Broadband Cloud Conference 2020 in a virtual format driven by the technology you've been talking about. So thanks for joining us, Michele.
Thank you, Aki. Keep well.